Hello and welcome to another episode of Building Success, a real estate podcast. My name is Nick, and I will be your guide as we talk to some of the best and brightest in the worlds of real estate tech, operations, and financials from across the globe. This podcast would not be possible without listeners like you, so if you like what you hear and you'd like to hear more of it, please think about subscribing on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts and leave a rating and review, as that really lets us know how we're doing and help keep the podcast going. Today I am speaking with Justin Segal. He is from Boxer Property, and today we talk about blockchain. And you may have heard of blockchain in the past as it relates to Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, but the applications of the technology go well beyond that. And we really dive into how it affects real estate, how it can and probably will affect real estate in the future. And Justin and Boxer Property have already implemented blockchain technology at their own business with the help of technology that Justin has co-founded in Stemmons Enterprise. So we dive into all of that, really break down what blockchain is for those of you who may not know, some more technical details surrounding it, but then really where that's going and the future of blockchain in real estate. So without further ado, let me present to you Justin Segal. So I am joined today by Justin Segal, president at Boxer Property. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
And before we get started on our topic, which is blockchain, I'd love to start with a little bit of background on you and what led you to Boxer and to our topic today.
Okay, great. Well, I was involved in Boxer from the very beginning. My older brother Andrew started the company while I was still in college, so it was a great summer gig for me to go and help him on the very first day of the business. This was back in 1992. We started buying distressed office buildings. Our initial properties were in Dallas, and through the early and mid-90s, we grew through Texas and opened up other markets and so forth. Today, we have about 150 properties across the country, about 1,400 employees all in, and we've expanded into hotels, retail, restaurants, and obviously still a lot of office buildings.
Okay, so let's talk about blockchain. If you could start by explaining kind of the concept of blockchain. I know for many, myself included, I've heard blockchain in the context of cryptocurrency, but from what I've been reading and starting to look up before this call, it seems like it's really starting to dominate a lot of other industries. Can you kind of just provide a synopsis of what blockchain is?
Sure. It's a very hot topic these days, but I find that a lot of people use the terminology and don't necessarily have a working definition. I think it's similar in many ways to the way people think about the internet. And it's an interesting challenge question to say to somebody, hey, do you use the internet? Do you know what it is? And they say yes. And then you say, can you define it for me? And you get kind of a little bewildered look sometimes. So I would think about that as a proxy. And if we said, okay, what is the internet? It's basically a series of computers that are connected and interact with each other using an established set of protocols. And that's a great place to start when we describe blockchain as well. So think about blockchain in general. And I'm going to start off by talking about the public blockchain, or one of several public blockchains, and we can later maybe distinguish between public and private. But a public blockchain is a series of computers that are owned by different people, individuals or companies sometimes. And those computers interact with each other and share information, typically replicating information between themselves using an established set of protocols. And when they do that, they use very complicated math problems, basically. They keep track of things using complicated math that is resource intensive and requires a lot of processing power and so forth. And that's the blockchain. Now, what happens with it is a bit of a longer conversation, but generally speaking, the reason that people call it a distributed ledger is because it's distributed in the sense that there's many different computers that are owned by different people, So if you want to hack into it and corrupt something, you would have to do it with all of them in order for them to really be compromised. And then it's a ledger because what it's doing is it's keeping track of things like you would kind of in an old-fashioned ledger. Every time something happens, you write it down. And this is what is particularly interesting about the blockchain is that you have a lot of different computers, and if they don't agree, then we know that there's a problem. But if they do agree, then we know that something happened when we said it did and that the information is accurate. So carrying on, what happens is these computers are connected together, they're sharing information, and somebody is paying for all of this. These computers are very sophisticated, and they use a lot of power, they need a lot of cooling, and somebody has to pay for that. So you think about why would somebody, and this is what we call and now I'm talking about the Bitcoin blockchain as a good example, why would somebody contribute their computer hardware, their connectivity, their power bill, and so forth? Well, the answer is that as the blockchain processes this information, it rewards the people who are contributing their computing power by giving them, in this case, Bitcoins. So if you're a Bitcoin miner, you put your computer on the blockchain, it does all this math, it keeps track of a bunch of things, it makes sure that it agrees with the other computers, and in return for that, you get something of value, namely a Bitcoin or a piece of Bitcoin. And there's some mechanisms as to how that actually happens, but basically that's what powers the blockchain. And then you can use those Bitcoins to do things like buy stuff in the real world or to avail yourself of the services of the blockchain itself.
And so what it sounds like to me from kind of a layman's standpoint is you're creating a system of witnesses and individualized records to prevent, in a lot of instances, fraud, right?
You could think of it this way, is if you and I were having this conversation just between the two of us, my word would be as good as yours. But if we were having the conversation in front of a large audience, and every single person in the audience was hearing what we were saying and later voted on which version of the conversation was accurate, then we would have a lot more trust in the situation, or in whatever telling of it we were suggesting was the truth. So what's happening is, with all these different computers kind of agreeing on things, we're decentralizing the trust associated with a given transaction. In other words, we don't have to go trust one record keeper. We can believe that the system is correct if everybody who's participating in it says it's correct. And when people talk about blockchain having the opportunity to eliminate the trust deficit, that's really what they're saying, is that we don't have to trust one company or one person or one system or, in many cases, one government. We can trust the blockchain overall.
So let's talk about some examples, and I want to get into real estate in a bit, but outside of real estate and the cryptocurrency, what are some other industries where blockchain can and probably already is being utilized?
Sure. Well, first of all, currency is something that people talk a lot about, and I would distinguish between two types of currency, or rather than saying currency, maybe we can talk about things that hold value.
Sure.
So we have something like a dollar bill, which carries value, and it standing behind it is the U.S. government. But if somebody wants to use a store of value that is not trackable or enforceable or so on and so forth, or related to a government, then they might use something like a Bitcoin. And that's what I would think of as a general currency. There's also specific use currencies that are that would allow you to do a very specific thing. For example, Airbnb might float a coin that is usable to rent Airbnb accommodations that are marketed through their site, or McDonald's might create something that allows you to trade it in for hamburgers, and so on and so forth. And so you're seeing some specific use things come up, and this has been the subject of a lot of rampant speculation, but some of them actually do represent real value and that's one use that we're seeing. But when we want to get past that, we have to understand, why is it that something of value is tradable on the blockchain in a way that's different from kind of doing it in the normal way? And the idea is that the blockchain can really track kind of who has done something, and in this case it's who has purchased or who owns that currency. But we don't have to use that capability of the blockchain for the purpose of establishing who owns the currency. We could do it, for example, to say who signed that document, or who approved that budget. So there's a whole world of transactions where somebody's involvement or participation in a transactional chain is something that we want to have on the blockchain. For example, maybe you and I are, maybe you're a mortgage lender, and I have to give you a bunch of information about my assets and income and employment and so forth, and we want to make sure that all of those things have been submitted to me and that they're in the proper form, and that nobody can question whether I submitted those things in a timely way or what the information was on there. So if we do that on the blockchain, we don't have to go and audit the mortgage file and have a state inspector come and look through the files every quarter and so on and so forth. It's basically there, and we know it's there. So there's a whole world of kind of transaction administration that could be very interesting in blockchain. And this can go to things, not even just complicated things, but hey, maybe I bought a ticket for a concert, and I want to be able to sell that ticket to somebody else, and they want to make sure that I didn't sell it to two people. So I can only sell it to one person. The blockchain will make sure that the person that I sell it to has actual rights to use that ticket. This kind of rights transfer is another important thing that is happening in blockchain. So if you think about, for example, today, if you were to buy, you and I were to start a company together, and I owned half the company and you owned half the company, and I wanted to be able to sell my shares in the company to somebody else, maybe I could do that on blockchain, and then there wouldn't be a question in the future as to whether this new person was actually an owner or not. And similarly, maybe they want to look at the partnership agreements to make sure that it's the version that you actually sign that allows them to purchase an interest on it, and they can do that on the blockchain as well and know that it's the operative document, and that the version that I'm showing them is in fact the version that you agreed to. Those kinds of transactional things are also very much possible on the blockchain, and possible in a way that, again, we don't have the trust issue that we would have if we were relying on somebody else's representations or somebody else's record keeping.
So we wouldn't have the trust issue. Talk to me a little bit about privacy and security. Would this all be public information that's being shared since so many people have access to the records, or is there a way to kind of make it more confidential about what is actually being shared across all of these different computers?
Well, I think there are many ways to protect privacy. If you put something on the blockchain, somebody still has to get it, and then you look at what it is and you determine, whether that is something that could be used in a way that would cause a problem for somebody's privacy. So, in some cases, we might store actual information on the blockchain. For example, let's say we're talking about medical records, and we say, well, we're going to put that information on the blockchain or on a blockchain. And again, we really haven't gotten into the difference between public and private, but there's certainly a world of private blockchain where this security conversation is no different than what you would have if you were just talking about a company's database, like your hospital, for example. But let's say we're talking about storing medical records on the blockchain. There's one version where we can put the records on the blockchain and make the access to them available to anybody, and another version where we can make the access to them available only to people who have a particular code or a key. And so now that code or key really is the thing that is important with respect to privacy. kind of in the same way that if I gave you my account information for my bank, and I gave you my mother's maiden name and a whole bunch of things like what's my favorite sport and so forth, you could probably call up the bank and get them to tell you things because you had the information that they consider to be operative to unlock the security aspects of that information. So you could put the whole thing up there, let anybody see it. You could put information up there and make it available only to somebody who has the right code, and then furthermore, you could do things like make those codes expire after a certain amount of time, or only be available to unlock certain information. For example, I might want you only to see the medical records over the past 6 months, and maybe I could do that as well with a code. So I think it doesn't really create privacy issues in the way that one might think, because you can also decide what you want to put up there and how you want to make it available to people. And not everything has to go in a public blockchain.
Got it. So let's talk about real estate and where possible applications for this blockchain technology might lie.
Okay, so I mean, first of all, there's a lot of conversation about chain of title, and so if you're familiar with how title insurance works and how land records work and so forth, if somebody is going to buy a piece of property, they get the legal description of the property and maybe a deed, and they would go to the recorder's office and they would trace that back to make sure that there was a chain of title going all the way back to some period of time where they felt that it was a reliable ownership. So they would want to trace it back, and then they would trace it back the other way to make sure that it wasn't sold to two people. So if you sell me something, I might want to trace it back 5 or 6 people earlier in the chain of title, and then go in the other direction and make sure that none of those people sold that to more than one person, therefore giving you a defective title. And that way I know I'm buying something that you actually can sell me. Well, with blockchain, that can happen much more elegantly because there's a computerized and non-fakeable record of that. So we can just kind of go back down the chain, and we know that it hasn't been sold to 2 people because you can only transfer it to one person on the blockchain. So that would be one thing, and there's a lot of conversation about how the title market and recording and title insurance, and anybody who has ever bought a piece of property or been taken out to a basketball game by the local title insurance company knows that getting rid of all of that stuff and getting rid of the insurance that comes along with it would be a significant disruption to an important part of the industry. So that's one, is just records. The next thing is actual transfer of ownership or property rights. So for example, right now, I'm a landlord, and I'm giving you the right to use space in my property. I sign a lease with you, and that lease document is the document that gives you and controls your right of access to that property. Well, if you want to enforce that or sublease it or do any number of things with that, we're just working with a paper document, and it's difficult to. I shouldn't say difficult because we're all used to it, but we rely on that paper document to show your interest in the property. And the same is true if maybe we have a partnership together and we both have partnership interests and we sign a partnership agreement and so on and so forth. But again, if I want to transfer that to somebody else, if there's a question as to the validity of it, as to the terms of it, as to whether it is enforced or not, we're going back to paper as opposed to something that is more reliable, which would be blockchain. Now, it doesn't magically get rid of disagreements, and this is something that people need to also understand, is you can still have an agreement that says you can't sublease the space, and just because somebody transfers an interest on the blockchain doesn't suddenly invalidate the terms of the agreement. On the other hand, it does open opportunities that wouldn't be there otherwise. For example, let's say we were selling timeshares or fractional interests in a property. Maybe we were sharing a house in the Hamptons for the summer, like we used to do back in college. But we wanted to be able to make those interests liquid and tradable. It would be somewhat difficult to do it now, but if it was on the blockchain and the contract was properly structured using the right kind of technology, then it would make that property interest much more transferable and easy to transact with. And I think that creates an opportunity that we don't currently have in current usage of property interests and property law.
The way that you're saying that sounds so much to me like a digital notary.
Well, there's definitely a component of that, is that it's you're able to validate the fact that somebody signed it when and where and in the form that they said that they did, and that's really kind of what a notary does. But let's say, just as an example, I was running a ski hill, and I wanted to sell you a certain number of runs and allow you to purchase runs and then to resell them. Maybe I'm going to sell you 1,000 runs, and you can sell them to people, and you can kind of charge them a little bit more if you want to, and those runs will be valid for the next ski season, and every time one of them is used, you can't use it again, right? Mm-hmm. With the traditional ski ticket, it would be much harder to do that. I mean, how would I? Right? Yeah. Whereas if the runs were blockchain codes and we had a little app and you could transfer those codes to me, maybe I'm going to buy 100 runs from you and I'm going to hand some of them to my kids, it would be no problem. And you would just hold your app up, when you connect your app to your facial recognition thing or something, and it would understand that those runs have been used, and it would allow you to sell them to me, and I wouldn't have to worry that you were selling me something that was bogus, and that when I showed up, in Colorado somewhere with my kids and a bunch of skis and new helmets and goggles and everything, that it wouldn't work. So that's a business model that would be difficult to accomplish with the current technology, but would be quite easy to do if the ski hill was running on blockchain. And so now we can think about, maybe I'm going to, instead of signing a deal with WeWork, I'm going to have a certain number of times I can use the conference room, or a certain number of days I can be in the office, or maybe I can, take the whole floor from you, and I can essentially sublet it or cut it up into smaller portions that I can resell or transfer to people, and they know that I'm doing something that's okay, and that I have the right to do it, and that they'll be able to use the space and take advantage of the protections and liability insurance and power and connectivity and so forth that is part of the contract with the landlord. So it does kind of open up some new business models that would be much more difficult to accomplish without the ability to kind of gracefully trade or transfer property interests and not have to always be worried that it wouldn't be enforceable or that the person doesn't really have the right to do that.
So definitely a lot of really cool possibilities on the horizon. And what I'd like to do now, if you don't mind, is tell me a little bit about what you've enabled at Boxer Property. What are some things that you're doing now? Because you've spoken of a lot of really cool possibilities out there in the future, but what's kind of already happening now?
Sure. And that's a great distinction, because we hear a lot about the things that will happen and can happen in blockchain, and I love that stuff. I mean, it's super fun to sit here and kind of think of ideas and to imagine the way that the world will be. But a lot of the things that people are talking about now require significant cooperation between multiple counterparties, many of whom will be working in a very different way than they are today. And so those kinds of things take time. It's really a transformational process that we're talking about the industry, as opposed to something that we can do today. So I was thinking about that and realized that there were some very important things that we could start doing immediately that utilize blockchain. And probably the most significant one has to do with records relating to a property. So to be clear about it, again, as mentioned before, there's one way of providing records that involves storing things on the blockchain. So, for example, we could store our deed or a deed of trust or a lease or something like that on the blockchain. And that's interesting, but really doesn't, in the current business model, provide a huge benefit other than just, making sure we didn't lose something. On the other hand, there's another way that we can use the blockchain, which is to provide validation of records that we give somebody. And this takes a couple of steps to understand, but I'll start with the concept of a hash. So and you may or may not be aware of this, I think you kind of are, but for the benefit of anybody who's not, a hash is a way of taking a complicated piece of information and reducing it to one number. So, for example, if I have a book, I could, for example, count up the number of times the letter E appears in the book, and then multiply that by the times the letter A appears in the book, and then multiply it by the number of pages, and so on and so forth. And at the end of it, I could have one number. And it doesn't really matter how big that book is, and we can make the number kind of a normal size, if you know what I mean. And the thing that's interesting about that is that if I give you the book and you know the algorithm, then you should be able to generate that number anytime. If I give you the number, you're not going to be able to recreate the book. So it's a one-way street. Mm-hmm. However, if I give you another version of the book and I changed a few things in it, even if I changed one word, it would result in a different number. So, for example, if I tell you this is the version of that book that was written in 1956, and I know there's many editions, but this is a first edition, and the text hasn't changed and it hasn't been modified in any way, you should be able to create that number, and it can match the number that we created back in 1956 and put on the blockchain, although that doesn't really make sense. And as a result, we're using that hash to validate something, even though we can't use it to create something. And so that gets very interesting. What we end up doing is having a very small footprint of data that we put on the blockchain. And in fact, we can make it even smaller than a hash because we do a hash of the hashes in something called a Merkle tree. And the mechanics of that are beyond the scope of this conversation, but the long and short of it is that if I give you some information about my property, you can check to make sure that information existed in that exact same form when I said it did. And so an example might be, let's say I give you a utility bill from 10 years ago. You should be able to know that utility bill was 100% accurate and that I'm giving it to you exactly the way I got it 10 years ago. Now, not super interesting for utility bill, but when we get to something like the foundation level laser readings of a house, where we really want to know, hey, this house was built 6 years ago, and I want to know if the foundation has settled, and someone's going to give me the information, but I want to know that it was totally accurate. That's something that we could do by taking a hash of that at the time it was created, putting the hash on the blockchain, and then giving you the ability to check that hash, validate it against the hash that you create today, and now we know that the information was accurate. So basically what we're doing is we're taking thousands and thousands and thousands of data points. I mean, every work order, construction projects, capital stuff, bids, reports, so on and so forth. And what happens is automatically, using a software system that we rolled out, those items we create a snapshot of those things. The snapshot then is used to generate a hash. The hash is stored on the blockchain, and the blockchain proof, or the information that you need to validate it later, is written back into the system. So basically, if I hand you, or if I sell you a property, then I can go through and give you all the property records, and you know that they're 100% accurate, or at least that they were accurate in the sense that I'm giving them to you in the same exact format as they were created at the time that I'm representing they were created. So one way to think about this would be, for example, if I were to sell you a classic car, and I told you that we had kept track of every single thing we did, all of the maintenance records, all of the replacement parts we put in it, who the mechanics were, so on and so forth, and I gave you all that information, and you wanted to know that it was entirely accurate. That's what we would be doing, but you do it now on the scale of a property. And I think that this kind of thing, where not only are we now expecting people to have good information about what they've done on site, and there's many information systems that allow you to do that, but we should also be expecting people to give us validatable versions of that information, so we don't have to rely on somebody's representation. We can cover the trust gap that way. And that's what we started doing at Boxer with blockchain.
And what's great is that it's beyond, from what you said, it's beyond just validation, which is kind of what we talked about at the beginning, and validating that a title makes sense throughout its life, but it's also seeing these timestamps of when things change, and if there is any inaccuracies, being able to pinpoint that it's this specific part of the blockchain that has an error that you're able to kind of kick out to maintain the validity of what it is that you're storing.
Yeah, the idea is that not only are we giving you a physical property, but we're giving you an information version of that property. And not only that, the information version is accurate, and to the extent that it's not accurate, you can discover the fact that it's not accurate very easily. And I think, if we think about how people purchase properties today, it seems kind of funny when you take a step back, but you realize that, they're buying a building and they don't really know what's going on. The state of the records aren't great, and to the extent that they are, it's hard often to tell whether it's accurate. So that's what we're seeing, is the ability to give somebody a digital representation of something and to be able to stand behind it and say that it's accurate. What I find particularly interesting about it is not just the fact that you can do that, but the impact that it has on culture. So, for example, if you're a maintenance engineer and you're going into a property, and your job is to check the balance of the fans, for example, and no one really knows if you're doing it or not. Well, that's fine. I mean, it's also, we trust people in many ways, but if that person understands that the results of their balancing are going to be recorded and viewable in the future and verifiable in the future, it changes the understanding of accountability. And I think that cultural change becomes very important as well, and potentially has much bigger impacts than the actual ability to validate something, is for everybody to know that they're validatable.
So talk to me about blockers that you might see in adoption. With some of these categories that we've talked about haven't currently been implemented, but what might keep other companies from wanting to introduce this kind of technology?
Well, when you say this kind of technology, we've talked about a lot of things. Some of them, as I mentioned, require multi-party collaboration and cooperation around things. So, if no one's going to buy my lift ticket single run tokens from me, then it doesn't really matter that I have it. We have to create a marketplace, and the ski hills have to adapt to things and so forth. And if no investor is going to give money on the strength of a blockchain property interest, then we have to all get there kind of together. And so that's something. The systemic changes have to happen in small increments, and eventually they'll reach a tipping point, and a lot of people will start doing it. So that's one kind of roadblock or mitigating factor for rapid adoption. But I think when we look at things that we can do in a single party stance, in other words, if I want to blockchain all of my incident reports or my compliance, to the extent that there's compliance with things, maybe there's testing of something that I have to do from a regulated standpoint, and I want to be able to validate that compliance on the blockchain. That is something that a single party can do. The thing that stops people from doing it is that current systems don't really have an interface to do this kind of stuff. In other words, if I looked at some kind of work order system or a leasing platform or an accounting system and said, hey, I would like to turn this on, if the system doesn't have a way to do that, then the company has to go and develop one or find somebody who can do it. Now, in my particular case, we developed our own product, which we're now making available to other people. But that required having software developers and having a vision and accepting the expense of developing that thing. And many companies kind of won't do that. So I think it's up to the software vendor community to start doing these kinds of things and making them accessible to companies so they don't have to essentially develop their own.
Well, thank you, Justin, so much for joining me today. This has been a really interesting conversation on my end for sure, and I appreciate you taking the time today.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for having me.
And if you'd like more information on Boxer Property, check out boxerproperty.com. And for all things building success, including past episodes, please visit mrisoftware.com/building success. And until next time, we will see you later.